Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will discuss the remaining part of the independent and the dependent sources. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the independent and the dependent sources, and we came to know that an independent source is a source whose value remains constant irrespective of the value of the current or voltage flowing in any part of the circuit element. So, if we have a voltage source whose value is 12 volts, then its value will remain 12 volts for all values of time. Similarly, dependent source is a source whose value of the voltage or current will depend on the value of the voltage or current in some other parts of the circuit element. Now we also discussed that the independent sources are represented by circle symbol and the dependent sources are represented by this diamond symbol. So we have shown here the different types of sources. Since this is represented by circle, so both these sources are independent sources, and since there is an arrow inside this circle, so this is a current source. So this is the symbol of independent current source. Similarly, we find that there is a polarity plus and minus inside this circle. So this is the symbol of independent voltage source because any voltage source is represented by plus and minus polarity. Now, this diamond symbol represents that this is a dependent source. This is also a dependent source. And since there is a polarity plus minus inside this diamond symbol, so this represents a voltage source which is dependent. So this is the symbol of a voltage dependent source. Similarly, here we find that there is a arrow symbol inside this diamond symbol. So this is the current source and it is a dependent current source. So this is the symbol of dependent current source. Similarly, this is the symbol of dependent voltage source. Now let us understand the concept of independent voltage source and dependent voltage source and current source with the help of some circuits. Here we have taken a circuit in which we have shown some elements. There are resistors and there are two sources. We find that this is a source which is having diamond symbol. So this represents that this is a dependent source, and this arrow represents that this is a current source. That is, this is a dependent current source. Now when we see the value of this dependent current source, its magnitude is 0.2 times of V1, where this V1 is the voltage of this circuit element. That is, V1 is the voltage across the 1 kilo ohm resistor. So we find that the value of this current source will always depend on the voltage of this resistance. Since the value of this current source is dependent upon the voltage, so this type of dependent current source is voltage dependent current source, because the value of this current source is dependent on the voltage in this circuit element. Similarly, we find that this source is represented by circle symbol. So this is an independent source and this is plus and minus polarity, and so it is an independent voltage source. Now let us consider the next circuit diagram. From this circuit diagram, we find that there are various circuit elements. These are the sources and these are the resistors. We find that this is a circle symbol, and since there are plus minus polarity, so this is a voltage source and this is an independent source. So this is the symbol of independent voltage source whose value is 2 volts. Now we find that this source is having diamond symbol. So this is a dependent source and this arrow represents that it is a current source. So this is the symbol of a dependent current source. Now when we see the value of this dependent current source, its value is 99 times of I1. Now what is I1? I1 is the current present in this 500 ohm resistor. So we find that the value of this dependent current source will always depend on the current in this resistor. So we can say that this is a current dependent current source because the value of this current source is dependent on the current in some other circuit elements. Now let us consider the third circuit. From this circuit we find that these are the sources and these are the resistors. Now this one is the independent voltage source, this is the independent current source, and this is the dependent source, and since there are minus and plus polarity, so this is the dependent voltage source. Now from the value of this dependent voltage source we find that the value is 30 times of I1, where I1 is the current in this 20 ohm resistor. So this type of dependent voltage source is current dependent. This type of voltage source will always depend on the current in this circuit element. So this is a current dependent voltage source. Now let us consider the next circuit. From this circuit we find that this one is the independent voltage source and this is the dependent voltage source, and from the value of this voltage source we find that the value of this voltage source is 10 times of V1, where V1 is the voltage across this terminal. So we find that the value of this voltage source will always depend on the voltage across this terminal. So this is a voltage dependent voltage source. So I think that now all the four types of dependent sources are clear to all of you, that when we will call it a voltage dependent voltage source, when we will call it a current dependent voltage source, when we will call the source as voltage dependent current source, and when we will call it as current dependent current source. So we can sum up this as any source can be classified as two types, that is any source will be of two types. It can either be a voltage source or it can either be a current source. Again, we can classify the voltage source as independent voltage source and dependent voltage source. Similarly, we can classify the current source as independent current source and dependent current source. Now again, this dependent voltage source can be of two types depending upon whether this voltage source is voltage dependent or current dependent. So if the dependent voltage source depends on the voltage in any other circuit element, then we will call it as voltage dependent voltage source. And if the voltage source is dependent on the current in some other parts of the circuit element, then that type of voltage source will be called a current dependent voltage source. In short, we can write a voltage dependent voltage source as VDVS, that is voltage dependent voltage source. Similarly, we can write a current dependent voltage source as CDVS, which represents current dependent voltage source. In a similar manner, any dependent current source will again be of two types. If it is dependent on the voltage in some other parts of the circuit element, then we will call it as voltage dependent current source. That is such type of current source which is dependent on the voltage in some other parts of the circuit element. In short, we will write it as VDCS, that is voltage dependent current source. Similarly, if the current source is dependent on the current in some other parts of the circuit element, then we will call that type of dependent current source as current dependent current source, or CDCS, which represents current dependent current source. So we find that there are four types of dependent sources. The first one is the voltage dependent voltage source, or VDVS. The second type of dependent source is the current dependent voltage source, or CDVS. Third type is the voltage dependent current source, or VDCS, and the fourth type is the current dependent current source, or CDCS. So now I hope that you have understood the concept of independent and the dependent sources.